not written by Daniel, whose name it bears, but about him and his three companions, whose name we heard repeated again and again in the text we read this morning. It is the story of these Israelite men as they were in exile in Babylon. And the person or individuals who wrote it were hoping to inspire the remnant of those post the Babylonian exile, to let them know that worship of their one God was something important, and it was something that people could indeed have as a transforming experience in their lives as well as that of others. This book, though it is a short one, has two segments. It is, yes, these uplifting stories of Daniel, and perhaps you know the story of Daniel who was in the lion's den and he came out unscathed. And the story that we heard read today. And then the second half of this story is filled with apocalyptic end-time images, some of which are in the book of Revelation that many of us studied together just a few months ago. But in many ways, Daniel as a character is similar to Joseph, who we know of in the book of Genesis. Joseph was someone who was a foreigner in Egypt, and because of particular gifts and skills he had, being able to interpret the dreams of the king, was brought into high places in the royal court. And so it was with Daniel. But I love this story because of the wonderful literary devices that the author, whose name we do not know, the literary devices that he or they used, or perhaps she, who knows, of course, she would not get credit. Maybe that's why the person's name is not there. I don't know. But Wendy, you can decide. Is Wendy? Probably so, Wendy said. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are Babylonian names. We don't know the Hebrew names of these men. But as you saw in this text, there's this repetition of many things. One is the names of these three men. We say their names several times, and of course, the furnace of blazing fire. The author intends us to get particular messages. These two, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were where? In the furnace of blazing fire. But the author also does some wonderful things, such as some very powerful descriptors that he uses. Says things like, the king's face was distorted. I mean, he just had that much anger. You ever met anybody whose anger was so intense that their face became distorted? Or perhaps you liked it, but you wouldn't know unless you were looking in a mirror. And then we have the king's command was so urgent and the furnace so overheated, and the king calling the strong men. And then we have the king was astonished. I love the use of the language here. Wonderful storyteller this writer is. But the writer also does something very important. In using details, wanting us to know some very specific things. Such as in verse 21, still wearing their tunics, their trousers, their hats, and their other garments. Now, I would not have stopped to think so much about that. I just know these guys are getting thrown in something really hot. So why does the writer tell us about the tunics and the trousers and the hats and the other garments? And that they are bound when they go in. When we see something like that, there's a purpose for it. And it is not until we come to verse 27 that we fully understand, or at least begin to understand, why the author was giving us the details about what they were wearing when they were thrown in. In verse 27, the writer says to us that the king and all who were gathered saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. But it goes on to say this: the hair of their heads was not singed, their tunics were not harmed. And here's my favorite: and not even the smell of fire came. Now, perhaps you might not be able to get my excitement about this if you've never been in a fire in your life. Now, if any of you have experienced a fire in the physical sense, you know when there's a fire, even after the damage is long repaired, the smell of the smoke lingers a long time. Or even if you've been in a context where people are smoking cigarettes and you're not even smoking it, and the smell of it starts adhering to you. You ever, maybe there was a time in your life, some of you who used to club. Even if you weren't smoking, you said, oh, well, I wanted to wear that outfit to church today, but it still has the smell of the smoke. Maybe that's what they do at First Presbyterian Church up the road. There is something about the smell of fire. And even if the fire itself doesn't happen, just the smell of the smoke that lingers a long time. Can't get it out. Can't get it out of the house if there's been a fire there. Or can't get it out of your hair. That's why I love this story. Understand the fires that happen in our lives. Those situations where it feels as if we've been thrown into a fiery furnace. Anybody ever experienced that? And sometimes it is such a hot situation. You say, I know they must have turned the heat up 7 times. And in the midst of it, just when you feel that you're not going to be able to survive the fire, something inexplicable happens. Just when you see that the folk who threw you in the fire are consumed by fire, you know it's all over then. And so you start pulling out your rosary beads, start calling on the ancestors and saying, well, Mama, I guess I'm going to see you soon. Start having a flash of all of the things in your life that you know were errors and harmful and hurtful to other people. Because you know it's all over. It's in that moment that the inexplicable and the unexpected happens. That the very presence of the divine comes right in the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. Right in the midst of it. Now, if you're like me, sometimes I say, well, God, can you come like a minute before they throw me in? But when you're in there and the divine shows up, most of us are not inclined to say, well, I wish you had come before. Right then we're saying, well, thank you, Jesus.